This happened in the small Belarusian town of N. It all began on February 1st of this year. That night, my former classmates and I gathered for our 20-year school reunion. For the first time, the entire class had managed to show up, which honestly surprised me. We had an indulgent feast, drank plenty, and time flew by. It was nearly midnight, and we were one of the last ones left in the cafe. We sat there, chatting and laughing, when suddenly the lights went out. It was not unusual. This had already happened 3 times that month, so no one panicked. Instead, we decided to use the opportunity to swap spooky stories. The drinks had loosened us up, and our imaginations ran wild. That is when I decided to tell my own experience. I live in an old 9-story apartment building, and on the first floor, there is a unit that the owner rents out from time to time, but for some reason, all the neighbors avoid it like the plague. They even go as far as warning new tenants, begging them not to move in. Since I had not lived there long, I never understood why this apartment had such a reputation. One day, my elderly neighbor, Baba Liuda, one of the women terrified of that apartment, asked me to help move some furniture. I agreed, and afterward, as we drank tea, I casually asked her why people were so afraid of it. I was skeptical. I've never believed in curses or supernatural nonsense, but her story was so detailed and unnerving that, for the first time, I felt a chill run down my spine. She told me that when the building was newly constructed, about 30 years ago, a woman named Yara lived in that apartment. She was attractive but unmarried, and her loneliness consumed her. She had feelings for a man she frequently invited over, but after a year, he married someone else. Devastated, Yara fell into despair and, eventually, obsession. She stopped taking care of herself and, in her desperation, turned to black magic. Neighbors saw her wandering toward the nearby forest late at night, always returning in the morning with bundles of strange herbs. She began capturing stray dogs and cats, dragging them into her apartment, and afterward, silenced. No one ever saw the animals again. It wasn't long before people assumed she was sacrificing them. The residents stopped walking their dogs near her building, avoiding her completely. One night, someone saw Yara dressed in a wedding gown, her face veiled, carrying what looked like animal carcasses into the woods. That was the last time anyone saw her. At first, neighbors thought she had moved away, but then a rumor spread. A wedding dress had been found in a swamp within the forest. Rescuers searched for a body, but none were found. People whispered that Yara had attempted a ritual and sold her soul to something dark. From then on, strange occurrences plagued her apartment. Neighbors would hear eerie singing in an unknown language, the shattering of glass, and see fogged-up windows, despite no one living there. When I pointed out that the apartment seemed perfectly normal now, Baba Liuda ignored me. Years later, a man bought the place but never lived in it, instead choosing to rent it out. The first tenant was a single man who only lasted a few nights. One evening, neighbors heard him screaming in terror. Then, in the middle of the night, he ran out into the hallway in his underwear, shouting at someone unseen inside the apartment to leave him alone. He moved out the next morning. Another potential tenant fled in fear before even finalizing the lease. Word spread, and soon, no one in town or even the surrounding villages dared rent the place. A year later, a visually impaired woman from out of town moved in. On the day she arrived, the neighbors warned her about the apartment's dark past, but she did not seem concerned. People waited, expecting something to happen. Yet, the first night passed in silence, then the second. No unusual noises, no sightings. Some were disappointed. The one local drunk swore that on the night she moved in, he saw Yara herself, naked and wild, fleeing from the building. Of course, no one believed him. A month later, the apartment owner arrived to collect rent. No one answered the door. When authorities entered, they found the woman's belongings and even her money untouched, but she was gone, vanished without a trace. After that, the apartment became known as cursed. The owner tried desperately to sell it, but no one would buy. Meanwhile, the neighbors made it their mission to warn away every potential tenant, making sure no one else would suffer the same fate. A couple of years ago, a girl finally decided to rent that apartment. She brushed off all the warnings with a smile. That very night, the neighbors heard a gut-wrenching scream, interrupted by sobs, coming from the cursed apartment. Someone was frantically calling for help. The voice continued without a break, filled with desperation. Unable to bear it, the neighbors called the police, but they could not wait any longer and broke down the door themselves. Inside, they found the same woman who had rented the apartment 25 years ago. She was lying naked in the bathtub, either covered in sand or something else, screaming hysterically. She struggled to get out of the tub, but her muscles seemed paralyzed. What confused everyone was that she kept shouting that she could not see anything. Strange, because back when she first rented the apartment, she was almost completely blind. But the most bizarre part, the new tenant was nowhere to be found. Her belongings were still in the apartment. Even her documents, to this day, no one knows where she went. After finishing my story, I noticed the stunned faces of my classmates. Everyone was silent, wide-eyed, and that amused me. But what struck me the most was Valak, who was sitting directly across from me. He looked like he was about to cry, shaking with fear. I joked to lighten the mood, and people smiled, but Valak remained frozen, not himself. So, I asked him what had gotten him so deeply. His story left me speechless. A lump formed in my throat, and tears welled up from pure terror, no matter how hard I tried to hold them back. Valak, it turns out, is the head doctor at a mental hospital 40 kilometers away from our city. About 2 years ago, an elderly woman was brought in, one who had been missing for years. They found her in the house where she once rented an apartment, naked in the same bathtub, hysterical. When they asked her where she had been all this time, she started rambling about mirrors and witches. No family could be found, so she was kept at the hospital. Was this all just a coincidence? Under the influence, I felt like Sherlock Holmes and begged Valak to let me meet her. He agreed, clearly just as eager to uncover the truth. The next morning, we went to the hospital. When we arrived, we were told not to call her by her real name, Valeria Sergeyevna, as it might provoke a strange reaction. Instead, we should call her Yulia, as she preferred. Valak led me to a room they called the playroom. It was essentially a group therapy room. After a few minutes, a frail woman, possibly around 70, was escorted in. I sat opposite her by the window and took the chance to observe her closely. She was extremely thin, with long gray hair, and her facial features were small, dry thin lips, a hooked nose, sunken cheeks, and a sharp chin with a dimple. She sat quietly, her eyes closed. Yulia. No, just Yulia, the woman responded softly, without opening her eyes. My name is Pavel. Pasha, I said. I know, Pasha. I hope maybe someone will believe me. Yulia, please tell us what happened that night. Try to remember everything as clearly as possible. I can, she replied. The more people know, the better. You're a journalist, aren't you? Yes, I answered, for some reason. She smiled faintly. Then listen. I took out my voice recorder to document her story accurately, although I had to clean up some of her ramblings to make it clearer. I came from a village called M, about 10 kilometers away from here. I got a job at your sewing factory, and I thought I would live well. I started looking for a cheaper place to stay, and I found an ad for a whole apartment at the same price as a room. So, I took it. The first day I moved in, 3 old ladies came over, warning me about a witch who might kill me. Being from a village, I did not believe it. I just nodded politely and sent them away. The first thing I wanted to do was take a bath. I left my things in the hallway and slipped into the tub. I locked the door behind me, even though I was alone in the apartment. It was a habit from living in a big family. The light was dim, a single incandescent bulb casting a warm orange glow over the small bathroom. The large mirror above the sink was covered in a thick layer of dust. The bathtub was deep, which was a relief because I'm nearly 1.8 meters tall. However, The tub was covered in black stains, and there was sand at the bottom. I tried to wash it away with water from the shower, but it came out in a thin stream. It took me 10 minutes to make it somewhat clean. Once I got in, the cold tub sent chills across my skin, but the water was warm. I closed my eyes and relaxed as the water slowly rose, covering me completely. It felt soothing as the tension in my muscles melted away. The water kept filling slowly. Out of sheer boredom, I began to examine the room. The dirty grey tiles were cracked and crumbling in places, and the ceiling was in a sorry state. The whitewash was bubbling and peeling off in large patches. From my vantage point, the mirror seemed even larger and more menacing. The pipes hummed monotonously, and with the hum, I swore I could hear a faint sound, something like a whisper. I could not be sure if it was real. After all, the brain often picks out supposed meaningful sounds from noise, even when they don't exist. Finally, the water reached my shoulders. I turned off the tap, and every now and then, a drop would fall from the faucet, splashing loudly on the surface of the water. I could not help but notice the drops fell approximately every 8 seconds. When I soaked in the bath, I often liked to submerge myself under the water and see how long I could hold my breath. I had gotten pretty good at it over the years, sometimes managing more than 3 minutes. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes, and sank below the surface. The rhythmic dripping of the water gave me a way to measure how long I had been submerged. 32 seconds, drip. 40 seconds, drip. 48 seconds. Suddenly, I heard a strange sound, as though something was scratching at the bottom of the tub. I thought it might be a mouse, but I was not afraid of mice, so I did not think much of it. 1 minute 52, drip. 2 minutes. The scratching intensified, a relentless noise that sent chills up my spine. It wasn't a mouse. My back could feel the vibrations of whatever was beneath me. As the vibrations crept up the side of the bathtub, panic began to rise in me. 2 minutes 24, drip. 2 minutes 42. By now, the creature, if that's what it was scratching faster, more furiously. I could feel its presence, moving closer. Why didn't I get out of the water? I guess I was too terrified to face whatever it was. My heart raced, pounding in my chest, and I was struggling to breathe. But something deep inside of me told me that as long as I stayed underwater, I would be safe from whatever lurked above. 2 minutes 56, drip. 3 minutes and 4 seconds. And then, silence. The scratching stopped. The sound of dripping water ceased. My heart beat in my ears as I remained underwater. Tentatively, I opened my eyes. Darkness. The light was gone. How could I not have noticed it earlier? I was submerged in pitch black water, and the thought of rising to the surface filled me with dread. My lungs were burning, and the fear of what awaited me above kept me submerged. I forced myself to stay calm, trying to tell myself that this was all just my imagination, but I could not stop the rising panic. I exhaled, sinking to the bottom of the bathtub. I was running out of air, my vision starting to blur. I knew I had to surface before I lost consciousness. Using my hands to push off the bottom, I began to rise slowly. And then, just as I took in a deep breath, a creaky voice right in front of me whispered, 328. Before I could react, someone grabbed me by the throat and yanked me back into the water. My heart seemed to leap into my throat, and a wave of pure terror swept over me. My body fought to escape, but the hand that gripped my throat felt like stone, unmoving, unyielding. I screamed, but it was useless. I was drowning. Desperation clawed at me as I pressed my feet against the side of the tub, trying to break free, but the grip on my throat did not loosen. Suddenly, I heard my phone ring, sitting in a pile of clothes on the floor. The light from the screen illuminated the room for a split second, and then I saw her, an old woman, maybe 70 years old, with black, thin lips and eyes, white eyes that stared straight through me. Her hand was still wrapped tightly around my throat. She must have been blind, but it did not matter. Her gaze was piercing, as if she could see right through me. I prayed for the ringing phone to distract her, hoping it would give me a chance to escape, but as though she could read my mind, the woman smiled, revealing rotten teeth, sparse and yellow. The phone stopped ringing. The room fell into darkness again. I scratched and clawed at her hand with all the strength I could muster, but it was like trying to move a mountain. Her grip did not budge, and then, to my horror, she began to laugh. The laugh was mine. My voice twisted and distorted in the darkness. I was losing hope. The strength was draining from my limbs. In that moment of despair, my foot brushed against the chain of the bathtub plug. It was my last hope. With trembling toes, I managed to hook the chain and pull it up, dragging it toward me. It was agonizingly slow, but finally I did it. Victory, or so I thought. The water began to recede, but not fast enough. My lungs were burning again, and my muscles screamed with pain. I could not fight anymore. I closed my eyes, gave in to the agony, and let go. I woke up in the bathtub, empty and cold. I must have passed out from lack of air. My body felt numb and weak, and I could not move. I screamed, my voice hoarse and weak, but no one came. My throat felt like I was speaking in someone else's voice. Finally, someone came rushing in. I was taken to the hospital. But when I woke up there, I noticed something strange. My skin was wrinkled and sagging, like that of an old woman. At first, I thought it was from being in the water for so long, but then I realized I was blind. The nurse seemed surprised when I asked what had happened. "It's broad daylight outside," she said, "but you can't see anything, can you? You are blind." That's when it hit me. The body, the face, it was not mine. The realization struck me with full force, and a wave of dread washed over me. I began to feel every inch of my body, and it became clearer than ever. I was not in my own skin. It was the same old woman from the bathtub, the one who had taken my place. The chilling turn of events deepened as the old woman, with her grip tightening around my elbow, yanked me closer. Her face, twisted and grotesque, was mere inches from mine. Her empty white eyes staring into mine with an intensity that froze me to the core. I could feel her shivering violently, and her tears poured out, dripping onto my skin. The seconds felt like hours, each one stretching on endlessly. Her raw, desperate scream then shattered the silence. "My name is Ivanova Yulia Alexandrovna, born in 1992. I am from the village of M. My mother's name is Ivanova Oksana Yacheslavovna. My father is Alexander Vitalyevich. Please, if you don't believe me, check. I am in this body by mistake. It is not mine. Free me, I beg you." The terror paralyzed me. I felt a cold, icy grip on my heart as I struggled to process her frantic words. I glanced at Valak, standing by the door, his eyes wide, frozen in place, seemingly unable to act. The man was as stunned as I was. I tried to pull away from the old woman, but her hold on me was unyielding. She continued to scream at me, pleading for my help, her voice cracking with desperation. It was then that I noticed something horrifying. Her hand, the one gripping my arm, was covered in white, jagged lines, like fresh scratches. My throat tightened, and I instinctively tried to pull away. Just then, orderlies burst through the door. The noise of the commotion must have alerted them, and they rushed to my aid, pulling the woman away from me. I stumbled back in shock, gasping for air as the situation spiraled out of control. With trembling hands, I fled from the mental hospital, my mind a blur, my heart racing. I didn't even remember how I ended up in Valak's car. I could barely focus on anything, my mind still reeling from the horrors I had just witnessed. Valak, pale and silent, drove us back to the city, not a word between us. The stillness in the car felt suffocating. I spent the entire day online, searching for any traces of similar occurrences, anything that could explain what had just happened, but I found nothing. Nothing. I could not shake the feeling that I was missing something, that the puzzle was incomplete. That night, sleep eluded me. My mind buzzed with questions that refused to be answered. By morning, I had made up my mind. I would go to the village where the woman had claimed to be from. I had to see if her story had any truth to it. I packed a bag, grabbed my bike from the balcony, and waited for the first light of dawn. As soon as the sun began to rise, I hit the road, my mind racing with thoughts of how I would face the woman's parents, if they even still lived there. The ride to the village was long and agonizing, my thoughts consumed with the possibilities. When I finally arrived, I asked the first elderly man I saw about the Ivanovs, Oksana and Alexander. The man knew them. I pressed on, asking about their daughter, Yulia. His reply sent a shockwave through me. Yulia had disappeared years ago, vanishing without a trace. I felt the world tilt beneath me, the blood drain from my face. The old man described the house where the Ivanovs lived, but I did not wait to hear more. My heart was pounding, and my head spun with the implications of what I had just learned. Could it be true? Was the woman in the mental hospital really Yulia, somehow returned in an entirely different body? Without another word, I mounted my bike and raced back to the city, my mind a whirlwind of disbelief and terror. The old man's voice faded behind me as I pedaled faster, consumed by the realization that the impossible might just be possible. Back home, I could not stop thinking about what had happened. I tried to piece together a logical explanation, but nothing made sense. Maybe the old woman had known about Yulia, and somehow had taken on her identity, trying to convince me of her story. But why and how? Where had she been all these years? What was this madness about body switching? How was this even possible? I spent sleepless nights turning the possibilities over in my mind. At the start of the summer, I visited my relatives in the countryside. I shared my story with my aunt, who in turn told it to a local witch. The witch's explanation shook me to my core. She believed the old woman, Yulia, had become tied to some otherworldly force, a being that could only exist in the material world by taking over human bodies. The bodies did not last long before they wore out, and so she had to change bodies repeatedly. To stop this cycle, the mirror in the bathroom had to be broken. Through that mirror, she had crossed over to our world, and from there, she could claim new bodies. The next day, I returned to the city with a new sense of purpose. I went straight to the apartment. The door had already been broken down, and the lock had not yet been replaced. I entered without hesitation, determined to break the mirror. But what awaited me inside, it was more than I had bargained for. Valet called yesterday. He had some news. Yulia, the woman who had pleaded with me, was dead. She had passed away, and, in her last moments, she wanted as many people as possible to hear her story. I felt a heavy weight on my chest. I had not been able to share this with anyone, not the media, not the police. They would never believe me. So, I wrote it here, hoping someone, anyone, might understand. Hey, I hope you've enjoyed the story so far. If you do and you want to hear more, please leave a like and subscribe to my channel, and leave a comment down below, as it lets the algorithm know that you like my content and it promotes it to more people. My goal for the channel is to hit 50,000 subscribers, and we're closing in fast, so thank you, and back to the stories. A little bit of background. Her particular subcampus of the college she went to was on the outskirts of Phoenix, AZ, and had originally been co-located with an Air Force airfield, cadet school, / something that ended up closing a long time ago, like pre-60s. So there were quirks to the campus, like senior housing, being in former officer housing, little bungalows, and a lot of abandoned buildings within sight of shiny new classrooms and dorms for the expensive honors engineering program. Apparently, a lot of meth use went on in this weird borderlands, but that's not really what this story is about. Be my sister, in college at the campus mentioned above, with her friends, bored out of her mind, see Phoenix, so they do typical bored teen stuff in a shithole. One such scuzzy activity, one of the kids liked to practice knife throwing in his dorm room, and subsequently put a bunch of holes in the wall and ceiling, obviously. I mention this because her and her friends were concerned that the kid in question would lose his dorm deposit, and were looking for paint that perfectly matched the dorm walls to repair and cover up the knife-throwing dipshittery. Obviously, the college does not sell its paint colors, so they are having a tough time. Remember this. More normal college shit they did. Urban exploring, the disused parts of campus, were they just never torn down the Air Force Base. A lot of beat-up bungalows filled with recent beer cans, ashes from fire, etc. College kids and meth shit. Neither super interesting or super risky. They were definitely told to be careful out there, but they might not have even been technically trespassing, and usually went during the day. One day, they notice a low-slung building that, while not quite new, is still definitely newer than the rest of the disused shit. Looks a lot like the current campus buildings, and somewhat similar to the student union, but just as abandoned. Broken and boarded up windows, a little bit of graffiti on the outside, etc. And also, way far off into the borderlands. They get excited and plan a more formal, nighttime expedition, since they assume something that new might be guarded. Try and do a little research, i.e. Google, and can't find anything on the nameless building, probably because it's nameless, duh. Night falls, and they excitedly head off into the meth necropolis, armed with flashlights and maybe B&E tools. Get to that building, just as dead and disused as they left it that afternoon. No signs of any security at all. The doors turned out to be completely unlocked, not common. They enter and find a shockingly clean campus building, as in, it looks like it is regularly cleaned. There is no furniture anywhere, but the hallways are spotless and appear freshly finished under their flashlight beam. Layout is a lot like their student union. Large central hallway, with what would have been a reception booth, 2 large rooms to each side. Okay, this is identical to the student union. They Scooby-Doo split up. My sister heading forward through the hallway with one group, while the other group heads off behind the reception booth. The hallway has glass display cases, like you would expect, empty, but also intact. They notice there is none of the otherwise omnipresent lizards scampering around, nor any roaches, nor moths, or anything else that usually thrives where people aren't. Suddenly, there is a terrified burst of electronic static from the wall. Their heart drops out of their asshole. Then they hear the voices of the other group through the static. Then they realize it's coming from an intercom on the wall. The other group found an intercom, tried it on a whim, and realized, to their shock, that it was powered on and mostly functional. My sister finds and flips a light switch, and the hallway is bathed in fluorescent light. The whole building is powered on. Kind of weird for a totally empty building, but okay. They reunite with the other group, feeling a little bolder now that they're doing it in a lighted building, but also beginning to sense something is wrong with all of this. Turn off the main hallway and enter one of the large rooms, probably intended to be a dining hall, judging by the layout. Still no furniture. Some places that looked intended for buffet tables, and a pair of those swinging kitchen doors. Big windows here, so they leave the lights off and move across to the kitchen doors, trying to keep the flashlights from flashing the windows. Beyond the doors, sure enough, there is a kitchen. Actually, some furniture/equipment here, a couple ovens, but not a full suite of equipment. Still nothing alive, and it is as spotless as the rest of the building. Kitchen is mostly a dead end, apart from a single red door at the back. I can't remember if she told me. It looked like a walk-in freezer door, or just a pantry door. Let's go with pantries. Anyway, still pretty emboldened, they decide to peek inside one of the doors. Opens onto a room lined with empty shelves, but something is wrong with the floor and walls, and they can't figure out what it is. It's like it's raised up a couple inches, and seems to eat their flashlight beams. Just absolute pitch black. Some of the floor seemed to be resting against the door, and fell out when they opened it. They risk flipping on the kitchen light to try and get a better look. The floor is covered in huge black flies. No, not covered, engulfed. My sister said it was literally 3 to 4 inches of flies on top of flies, all dead. They stare for a moment before one of them wordlessly closes the door. None of them want to admit any real fear, but people start making thin excuses about how it's getting late, and let's go back and have a little party before bed. These thin excuses are of course greedily accepted, and they start making their way out of the kitchen. The last one out turns the light off before bolting out the swinging doors. They creep back across the dining hall. They are back in the central hallway. They reluctantly turn out the lights, the switches near the center of the building, and head for the doors they came in through in the darkness. But one of the flashlights catches a glint off of something, right in the middle of the hallway they came through. 2 paint cans, the metal kind with the handles. They try to remember if they were there before, but nobody wants to think too hard about it. They get closer. The cans have no dust on them. The cans are untouched. The cans are unopened. The cans have big clear labels from University Building Services on them. The labels clearly state, dorm wall shade number 2354 or whatever. The paint is the exact paint the knife dipshit needs for his walls. The group holds in the hallway, holding their breath. Finally, the knife dipshit pipes up and claims it's not quite the right shade or something. This is obviously horseshit, but nobody is in any mood to disagree. They leave the front door, taking every care to walk and not sprint. Nobody looks back as they walk back to the main part of the campus. My sister said they really didn't do much exploration of the borderlands that year after this. The knife guy ended up cutting out a piece of drywall with a knife and taking it to a paint store to get a custom mix. They say nobody ever saw the security deposit again.